this is where we see Peter right now. He's strengthening and encouraging his brothers, and he's feeding the flock of God. And we see three things that he talks about in this passage. Number one, he calls for people to have a change of lifestyle, and we value this. Followers of Jesus are called to have a changed life. In verse 3, it says, "For you have spent enough time in the past doing what pagans choose to do." You see, in the past, before we knew Jesus, we did whatever we wanted to do. If we wanted to do it, we did it. If we didn't want to do it, we didn't do it, But we were our own boss. Literally, I guess a way of translating this would be, the things you did in the past were sufficient. Sufficient meaning it's fulfilled, meaning it's done. It means that it happened, but now it's over with. Like, there's no more that can be done. Now that you're in Christ, everything that was, okay, it happened, but now it's in the past. Christ covered it. And the way I like to think about this is almost like a cup of water that's filled up. Let me fill this up. Okay. Right now, that cup of water, it's sufficient. It's fulfilled. It's full. There is no more room. And this is like a representation of what our life is like. Once we come to know Jesus, our life from that point backwards is like this cup. It's filled up. There's nothing more than go into it. But if we continue to live our lives as Christians, but doing what we want and not living for God, not having that changed life, it's like pouring water into a cup that's already full. The water's wasted. It just, it's being wasted. It's going to go on the table and fall on the ground. In my case, I caught it in a saucer. I don't want it to go on the floor. But, if we continue to live our lives like the world, but we're Christians, we are wasting our lives. It's a waste of life. I don't like to say that anyone's life is a waste of life. I'm going to talk about in the third point how we are each called for an eternal purpose, not to waste our lives. But that's kind of what it's like. Our life, what we did in the past, is sufficient. It's satisfied. It's fulfilled. It's done. Like no more. Like, now let's move on to bigger and better things. Some examples that Peter gives that were common in those days of a life in the world is, and actually this list is actually very similar to the list that we would probably list off today in our culture. Debauchery. For those you don't know, debauchery is like extreme indulgences and sexual pleasure. Lust, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, and detestable idolatries. These are things that are very, very common today as they were common back then. And he says, the world is very surprised when we choose to not live like that. Because, there's a natural course that this world tends to follow. And, it may meander its way left and right. But, there's a general course. But God's course, God's way, is the opposite direction. It's a little different. And when we choose to not go along with the crowd, when we choose to swim upstream, people look at that and they find that that's a strange thing. Like, why would you not go along with what everyone else is doing? It seems very weird. And, even in high school or in school, when you're younger, if we don't fit in with the crowd, people kind of look at you kind of strange, like, that's kind of weird. That guy's weird, or that girl's weird. That's just human nature. And he talks about how us as Christians, we may be mocked or slandered for choosing to live a God-pleasing life. But in spite of all that, we need to stay consistent. We need to stay steady in our belief, in our convictions. Having a changed life, though, is not necessarily changing our actions. It's from the inside. It's living our lives completely for God. It's telling God that we're going to live our lives for Him. We're going to give our lives to Him. Now everything that we have now belongs to God. And this decision, like I said, it's made from the inside, not necessarily from the outside in, but from the inside out. And there's a worship song, I really like it. It's called Inside Out. And I want to just go over some of the lyrics in it. It's very interesting, some of the words. I think this song really catches the whole point of what I'm trying to grasp here, how it's from the inside, how it starts from the inside, how it's a work that God does inside of us. Your will above all else, my purpose remains. The art of losing myself to bring you praise. My heart and my soul, Lord, I give you control. Consume me from the inside out. Let justice and praise become my embrace to love you from the inside out. And the cry of my heart is to bring you praise from the inside, oh, my soul cries out. They kind of grasp the fact that when we live our lives for God, when we choose to have a changed life and we choose to follow God, it starts from the inside and works its way out. And the first lyric starts off, 1,000 times I failed, still your mercy remains. Should I stumble again, I'm caught in your grace. It's like, it describes how even on the outside, we're still going to make mistakes. Like we don't, our foundation is not on the outside. It's what Christ does on the inside of us. And that's what it means for living our lives for Christ. You know, and giving our lives totally to Christ doesn't mean that the church makes our decision or the church controls our lives or tells us what to do. Not at all. Living our lives for Christ means that we have a personal relationship with God. We walk with Him. Like, it's not a religion, it's a relationship with God. And that's the essence of Christianity. It's a relationship with a living God. It's there's a song by Nicole C. Nordman called My Redeemer Lives. And she talks about how her Redeemer lives and says, you know, He's still alive. And I even spoke to Him this morning. He lives. That is what Christianity is about. It's about having a relationship with God. Everything we have now belongs to Him. The second thing we see that Peter talks about is we actively love one another. And this is actually very important. He says in verse 8, above all, he starts it off in verse 8, above all referring to, out of everything he talked about, before and after, this has high priority. This has high precedence in everything he's saying. This has very high precedence. And why does it have high precedence? He actually gives his reason why. He says, because love covers a multitude of sins. You know, we are much more likely to pardon someone or forgive someone who we like. If we don't like someone, you know, we ain't gonna, you know, it's a lot harder for us to forgive the person. But if we like them, you know, we're more likely to forgive the person. And it's interesting what he says. I think the New American Standard translates it a little better than the NIV. It says, keep fervent your love for one another. That this almost implies that it's something that is intentional. Loving one another is something that we need to intentionally do. We need to actively do it. It's something that doesn't happen by itself. Like, by nature, we desire to be loved. But by nature, we don't desire to give love. Like, it's something that we need to intentionally give out. It's something we need to be very active about. Oops. The more we live in close proximity to any person, you know, there will be conflict. There will be tension. Anyone who lived with me, you know, everyone says I'm a pretty nice guy, but they see me on my Mondays and I'm not sometimes the nicest person, you know. My roommate can attest to that. Your roommates or your spouses know you very well on your Mondays. And this is a very, very important point, to love each other. And it's so important that Jesus says the two greatest commandments, if you can take the whole law and sum it up in two commandments, it's love God, love people. That's it. If you love God, love people, everything else falls underneath it. You know, if you love your neighbor as yourself, you know, you're not going to steal his wife, or you're not going to, you know, covet what he has. And you know what I mean? I mean, you're not going to murder someone if you love him. All the law falls under those two commandments. This is a very important one. And even Paul says, you know, it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter what you've done, and it doesn't matter what you have. If you don't have love for another person, everything is in vain. Everything is worth nothing. You know, you can have all the riches of the world. You can be Donald Trump, but if you don't have love, it doesn't matter. What worth is it? No love equals vanity.